Hello, everybody. Today we are going to look at photosynthesis. Now, in the previous video, we talked about this chemical called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And just like your car needs gasoline in order to run, all cells need this thing called ATP in order to run. So if you think of gasoline as having 3 letters, ATP has 3 letters. And as your car uses up the gas, you have to go and get more gas at the gas station. Well, we have a organelle in our cells called mitochondria, and mitochondria is the gas station. And so whenever our cells are running low on fuel, the mitochondria's job is to kick out this thing called ATP. Well, before we can talk about how ATP gets made, we have to talk about photosynthesis. Because in order to make ATP, the energy that all cells need, we have to have sugar. Sugar is the main ingredient in making ATP. And as animals, we cannot make sugar. That's why we have to eat plant products, because that's where we get our sugar from. So as we go through this video is going to deal with photosynthesis, and the next video will deal with what's called cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is the process in which nature makes sugar. And cellular respiration is where the cells take that sugar and use it to make ATP. So they go hand in hand. We have to talk about them together. And you're going to see that they're kind of the same, but they're kind of opposites. They both have 2 parts. And in the case of photosynthesis, photosynthesis makes what respiration needs. And respiration makes stuff that photosynthesis needs. So it's this nice cycle that we go through. But in the case of photosynthesis, we're going to be looking at how these things called autotrophs. Remember, autotrophs are things like plants, algae, bacteria that have the ability to take sunlight and use that to create sugar. So like we mentioned, energy originally comes from the sun. And the sun shines down on these creatures, and they, through evolution, came up with this way of making sugar. And so photosynthesis, as you know, is how we make that sugar. Now, when most things do photosynthesis, they are making glucose. If you remember back in the biomolecules videos on carbohydrates, glucose is the most common type of sugar in nature because this is what gets made in the process of photosynthesis. And again, if you remember your root words, anytime you see OSE at the end of the word, that means it's a sugar. Anytime you see glue or gly, it means it's a sugar. And the scientific formula for that, C6H12O6. And if you remember, anytime you see this ring, what's called a ring structure, like you see here on the screen, that represents that you have a carbohydrate of some type. Now, let me see here. My little picture is blocking the rest of the formula. But the main formula for photosynthesis is 6 CO2, which is carbon dioxide, plus 6 waters, plus energy. Now, a lot of formulas will have sunlight here. I don't like to do that because you're going to see in the next video, respiration is this formula just flipped around. So I tend not to put sunlight over the top. I tend to right here do plus energy. Because if you know the formula for photosynthesis, all you have to do is turn it around and you have the formula for respiration. And we don't do photosynthesis, but we do respiration, and we don't make sunlight. So common 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters plus energy makes glucose plus 6 O2 or 6 oxygens. Because you know that plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen, as you can see here. You know you have to water the plants, and you know that a byproduct is going to be glucose. Well, in this video, I'm going to kind of break this down into the 2 parts of photosynthesis, and we'll talk about where they work, which part does what, where does each part take place. Now again, just as a review, photosynthesis is carried out by autotrophs. Remember, the root word auto means self, troph means to feed. So these are self-feeders, which means they make their own food. We are heterotrophs. We have to eat. We cannot make sugar. So this is why, again, we have to eat different plant products. And just like in the former video, we talked about these things called pigments. And pigments are light absorbing molecules. And so remember, a lot of the pigments are named according to their color. And chlorophyll is the most common pigment. And we talked about how all different pigments absorb different wavelengths of light. And the color you see is the color that pigment cannot use. It spits it back out. So we talked about how chlorophyll really likes red light and blue light, and it hates green light. So it's going to spit that green light out. And since plants have more chlorophyll than those other pigments, the green is what shows up. Remember, there's also these things called accessory pigments. So like carotenes, which absorb different wavelengths and spit out orange. But chlorophyll is the dominant one. And the job of these pigments is to absorb light. And you're like, okay, well, why? Why is light so important? Because we have this organelle that you guys know, which is the chloroplast. And the chloroplast is found in green autotrophs, and it has two parts to it. One part's going to be responsible for what's called the light-dependent reactions, and the other part's responsible for what's called the light-independent reactions, or what I grew up calling the light reactions and the dark reactions. Now, in the case of the chloroplast, you can see what looks like these stacks of pancakes. Okay? Well, one pancake, this thing right here, just one little pancake, is something called a thylakoid. A stack of pancakes, in case you hear me say it, is called a granum. Now, a lot of people believe that the chloroplast is actually an ancient bacteria. It has its own DNA, it has a double membrane, and just like all cells have a cytoplasm inside of it, there is a goo inside of this guy, and that goo is called the stroma. So we're going to be focusing on this thing called a thylakoid, and we're going to be focusing on this thing called a stroma, because this is where the two parts of photosynthesis are going to take place. So here we go. Again, chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, and the job of a pigment is to absorb sunlight. So we're going to talk about how the plants use that sunlight. As you can see here, there's two steps to photosynthesis. One's called the light-dependent reactions, and the other's called the light-independent reactions. Now, you'll hear me call the first one the light reactions, and you might hear me call the second one the dark reactions. Well, that's what they were called a few years ago, but they've kind of gone away from that because it gave some people some misleading information. When you see light-dependent, when you depend on something, you have to have it. So the light-dependent reactions have to take place during the day. They have to have light. So these guys need light. Sorry about my handwriting. But your light-dependent reactions have to take place during the day. And so for many years, they were called the light reactions. Well, the light-independent reactions used to be called the dark reactions because they don't need light. But it made people think that they could only happen at night, and that's not true. But in the case of your light-dependent reactions, these have to take place during the day because they have to have light. Your light-independent reactions can take place anytime the plant needs it to, because it's going to use gasoline instead of light in order to run it. So you're going to see the light-dependent reactions come first, and what the light-dependent reactions make, that's needed for the light-independent reactions. Now, I'm going to do this my way. In the case of the light reactions, or I'm going to call it light LDR, for light-dependent reactions. And then we have the light-independent reactions. Now, the light-dependent reactions are also called the light reactions. The light-independent reactions are also called the Calvin cycle or the Calvin-Benson cycle, after the gentleman who figured out how all this stuff works. Now, I'm going to kind of do them side by side so you can see where they take place and what they involve. And again, pardon my handwriting. It's kind of hard for me to write on the screen, but the next slides will just be kind of a clearer picture of what we're doing here. So you've got a plant and it's outside. You've got it sitting in the sun so that it can absorb sunlight. So in both of these, we're going to talk about what they use. We're going to talk about what they make. And we're going to talk about where they happen. Now remember, both of these are happening in the chloroplast. We have what's called the thylakoid, and we have what's called the stroma. Think of the thylakoids as being Ziploc baggies full of a green liquid, because that's what thylakoids are. They're sacks of chlorophyll. So we have stacks of these stacks of Ziploc baggies filled up with green pigments. And remember, the job of chlorophyll is to absorb light. So in the case of the light-dependent reactions, these are going to take place in the thylakoid. Now, if you think about your formula, we've got 3 ingredients. We have carbon dioxide, we have sunlight, energy, and we have water. So somewhere in here, we're going to use those 3 ingredients. Well, in the case of the light-dependent reactions, this is where we're going to use the water, and we're going to use the sunlight. What the light-dependent reactions do is, it's a lot more complicated than this, but for high school biology purposes, this is how I always explain it. Plants use sunlight to heat up water. Just like you put water on the stove for it to heat up, you know that if it gets hot enough, you can cause water, the bonds to break, and water to fall apart. Well, that's what plants are hoping to happen. Plants are going to use that sunlight to heat that water up enough that it comes apart. And when it comes apart, it's going to make hydrogen. And it's going to make oxygen. Oxygen is O2. So the whole purpose of the light-dependent reactions is to heat up water. Because if you remember, we're trying to make sugar, which is C6H12O6. Well, I got to get my parts, I got to get my Legos from somewhere. So I have these houses that are already built, water, carbon dioxide. I've got to take them apart and use those pieces to rebuild. So I've got to take water apart in order to get my Legos that I need to turn around and build something else. Well, the whole purpose, like I said, of the light-dependent reactions is to heat that water up. You can just think of it as heating that water up. And when that water gets heated up, it falls apart. And it makes hydrogen, and it makes oxygen. Well, it's also going to create some ATP. So here under make, we've got hydrogen, we've got oxygen, we also have some ATP. This is why this has to happen during the daytime, because the sunlight has to heat the water up and break it apart. And anytime a process occurs where something falls apart, ATP gets made. So in the case of the light-dependent reactions, we are going to use sunlight and water, and we're going to make hydrogen, oxygen, and ATP. As you can see here, it occurs in the thylakoids. It takes light and water, and it gives off oxygen, ATP, and electron carriers. Electron carriers, think of it as hydrogen. Okay? When hydrogen comes apart and hydrogen's by itself, it's called H+. And hydrogen now is an ion. And ions cannot move around by themselves. So plant cells have little baskets. These little baskets are called NADP. NADP is basically a little basket that picks up hydrogen and moves it to the next spot. You can kind of think of it as a conveyor belt, because I need hydrogen to go to the next step, but hydrogen can't move by itself. So NADP, this thing called an electron carrier, is like a little conveyor belt, and it'll pick up the hydrogen and take it to the next room where it's needed to make the sugar. Now, you guys all know that plants breathe out oxygen. This is where the oxygen comes from that the plants breathe out. So, in the case of the oxygen, this oxygen is a waste product. This is what the plants breathe out. This is where we get our oxygen from. ATP and the electron carriers, which are carrying hydrogen, okay, they're then going to go to step 2. Okay. They're going to move into step 2, which is the light-dependent reactions. Remember, the light-independent. Remember, light-dependent reactions, they have to happen during the day because they need sunlight in order to work. The light-independent reactions can happen anytime because they're going to use this gasoline to work. Remember, ATP is the gasoline that cells use in order to run. And just like your car will run out of ATP, your cells will run out of ATP. So in the process of photosynthesis, the light-dependent reactions make the gasoline that the light-independent reactions are going to use. So let's look at the light-independent reactions. Now, in the case of the light-independent reactions, okay, this is going to occur in the stroma, and it's going to take the carbon dioxide from our formula, the ATP that we just made, and the electron carriers, which if you remember, are carrying the hydrogen. And I have my 3 ingredients. Remember, glucose is C6H12O6. Well, right here, I have the carbon and oxygen needed for my cake. And now I have the hydrogen needed, and I can mix them all together to make the sugar that I want. The light-dependent reactions take place in the thylakoid, these Ziploc baggies full of green pigment, and they absorb the light. And the job of that light, you can think of it as, is to heat up the water. It's not this simple, but this is just our basic. I think hopefully you'll understand this. It heats up the water and it causes the water to fall apart. The oxygen is then given off by the plant. That's how we have oxygen in our environment. The hydrogen is put on a conveyor belt and sent to the next room using something called electron carriers. And in the process, I make a little bit of fuel, and that fuel is called ATP. Once the light-dependent reactions are finished, I can go into the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle. This occurs in a different room, and that room is the stroma. And it's going to take the ATP that I just made, because it needs that fuel. It's going to take the hydrogen that I just made. It just got carried into the room through these things called electron carriers. And it's going to take the carbon dioxide from my formula. Now, it will break the carbon dioxide down, because think of the carbon dioxide as being a little Lego car. So you have this little Lego car with cherry red and orange Legos. And then you have this stack of hot pink hydrogen Legos. And so you need to build something brand new. So you have to take the carbon dioxide apart, and then you'll take the carbon, the oxygen, and the hydrogen, and you'll put them together to make something brand new. And what they're going to make is glucose. You'll also make ADP, which will then be recycled in order to make brand new fuel, which is ATP. So photosynthesis has two parts: the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. The light-dependent reactions take place in the thylakoid. The light-independent reactions take place in a different room, the stroma. The light-dependent reactions uses water and sunlight, and it makes oxygen, hydrogen, and ATP. The oxygen is released, and the hydrogen gets carried to the stroma, and the ATP is going to be the fuel needed to turn the light switch on in the stroma. And so we're going to take carbon dioxide, pull it apart, add hydrogen to it, and make glucose. And this is photosynthesis. So again, you can see our formula. In the case of carbon dioxide, this is going to get used in the light-independent reactions. In the case of water, this is going to get used in the light-dependent reactions. In the case of the sunlight, it gets used in the light-dependent reactions. The sugar will get made in the light-independent reaction, and the oxygen will get made in the light-dependent reaction.